Marten Kaevats holds a position at the Estonian Government Office. He is the advisor for the digital innovation for Estonian state. I believe he is one of the coolest and brightest minds we have in Estonia to enlighten us a bit on any of the topics related to there, from starting off the conceptualizing and legislation of the self-driving vehicles to innovation in all of the public domains and policies to something which we have as a mission and a vision in Estonia, invisible government. I'm sure you will mention something on that as well. But on top of that, we thought that Marten would be really good to meet today because he has a strong and inspiring background as a community activist and as a spokesperson for the volunteering in society. So let's try to put these two angles together, these two dimensions together. And God, I'm very thrilled to welcome you, Marten, here today and speak to us and inspire us. Let's exchange some ideas.
So, hello everybody. As Ylli mentioned, I work for the government. I'm the National Digital Advisor for the Government of Estonia, which means that I support the Estonian Prime Minister and government on matters on information, society and innovation. So this is kind of like an in-house visionary position, so I'm responsible for all sorts of new technologies, making them understandable for the existing bureaucratic structures, but also to the whole society. So more or less I go around, I kind of work like a circus bear, so I go around and give talks about different technologies. I do that for like 50% of my time, and the other side I'm actually responsible for the governance architecture in Estonia. So how do we build these new technologies, how do we put them into the existing framework so that emergence would occur? This would mean something like if you put it together in a way that works perfectly, then the end result of 1 + 1 does not necessarily come out 2, but it might come 20 or 200, or you actually cannot predict all of those things. And I'm educated as an architect city planner, and as Ylli mentioned, been basically working long time for the civil society, different action, organizing street festivals, also lot of stuff with youth, as I understand that many of you work in that domain. Then basically I would like to explain a bit about new technologies and how these change, but from the governmental perspective. I don't necessarily work for youth domain in specific, but I'm hopefully not as old. I'm similar age than the new Prime Minister of Finland, so it's all good. And also I have another gig. I'm work also for the World Health Organization, so I'm kind of responsible for the governance architecture of WHO, which basically means that kind of coming up with a plan how to make all of world healthcare information systems talk to each other. And this is also something interesting. But this is an example how this Estonian, very small country agenda has grown actually global. So we are not necessarily working only in Estonia, but there is lots and lots of cases probably in your countries as well, where some Estonian ideas have infiltrated. So what's the main thing? What's the difference? Why people talk about Estonia as being a digital country? I think one of the main things, and this is something that most Estonians even would not, this is the way I interpret it. Basically, if we look at the world today, then we see more or less two dominating governance structures in the digital domain. We see China doing centralized information system architecture where government is in control of the data. And we see US doing quasi-decentral corporate control information systems where big players like Google and Facebook and the private companies are in control of the information. Then I would argue that Europe, with GDPR and some data regulations around that, is taking steps towards a more human-centric approach. The idea where human is in control and the owner of their information. But in reality, Europe is quite slow. In reality, I would argue that Estonia, together with our brothers in arms in Finland, have the most advanced distributed architecture without Big Brother. So distributed architecture is an idea where you do not have the central server. You do not have the one ring to rule them all. It's about a community effort where every member of a community in the government, for example, does a very small bit, and there's a data exchange layer in between that helps to actually coordinate all of those efforts. I think this is important because if we look at the world now, if we look at the different technologies evolving, we see AI, we see different stuff emerging. This is really, really important because looking at from a philosophical point of view, like 15, 20 years in the future, then this is a question of free will. Because it's a question of will the Chinese government or the US corporates will control your mind in the next 20 years. Although you might feel it, but they will just offering you choices that are perfect, were adequate to this particular situation. But does that actually mean that you have free will? But in Estonia and Finland, we tried to build an architecture that actually provides choice. And I think that's why this kind of mission for this small country and of course our neighbors in Finland is highly, highly important because we are very small players in this map. This is like China, this is US. In the economical sense, we are not even like competing. It's not possible and we'll never will. But what we can do is lead by example. So show the world and show your own countries that this can be done, and this can be done in a positive, human-centric way. And how do we do that? Is basically Estonia implemented a distributed architecture already in 2001. This is a technology we call X-Road. This just more or less sets a few guiding principles how governance is done. One of those ideas, policies, is an idea called once-only policy. Once-only policy in Estonia means that if you have given any piece of your personal profile information to the government, then the government or municipality should never ask that again. So probably in all of your countries, I'm sorry, I don't know where exactly you are all from, but probably you've all been in this situation that you go to some public authority, might it be a municipality, might it be a government, and then first you stand in a line, you wait, you reach the place, and then you start filling out papers. You fill out your name, your birthday, your address, and then there's another paper and you still fill out your name, your birthday, and address. Why should the government ask those things? The government already knows your name, birthday, and address, and probably some other information somewhere in the ecosystem. So in Estonia, we managed to put all of those things together already a long time ago, and we built a culture around it. So if there's anything you can take home from this talk today about the digital Estonia and how we build an ecosystem around it, is that actually technology has got very little to do with it. It's more about building a governmental culture and also culture within the society or the mindset to basically be open-minded and try to solve problems through digital tools. Probably if you work in the youth domain, you also have certain degree of bureaucracy if you work for the public administration. Like doctors used to help patients, but now many doctors basically spend most of the time behind the computer. But at that point, they are not actually providing the value or the job that they are really good at. They are just doing some stupid bureaucracy. So this has all helped Estonia to build an ecosystem that is fairly advanced. We can do everything online except getting married and buying, selling real estate. And this has been here for more or less 20 years. So, but now we've been actually looking at, as probably all of you know, there is loads and loads of new technologies coming online. And I think the most this specific thing that has happened is that in a way that the time for implementation of new technologies is going shorter and shorter. So we could kind of say that in 15, 20 years we will have a steam engine every day. The steam engine was a kind of a symbolic technology that triggered the exponential growth curve of the human population and also thus the innovation and economical growth. But it also kind of changed the way we interact within the society. But as probably all of you know, internet and stuff, new gadgetry has changed this pretty radically. And there is loads and loads of new technologies coming. I can probably talk to you for hours about self-driving cars and how they affect the public space. Like one of the coolest examples is that in dense urban areas, it can allow actually 20 times less vehicles. Can you imagine 20 times less vehicles in Paris or Berlin or any other big metropolitans? But in order to do that, we actually need to change the business models, because this is about shared mobility. It's not about owning a personal vehicle, it's about sharing. So this is just one of those examples of technologies. But if we would add something like artificial intelligence and quantum computing and perhaps synthetic biology to that equation, then we actually cannot compute. We do not know what the life model will be, because the elements and components of that model are too great, and we cannot predict the future. So my point is, we can predict perhaps one technology, how with that will change us or how we interact, but we cannot never predict how all of those different elements come together, and how will that affect the way we live. Because not even with the biggest supercomputer you can do that, because humans are always creative, and the way we actually utilize technologies is something really different. One really good example of that is I think most of you have seen Back to the Future films, and there was this scene in 2015 where they were depicting the year 2015. That was like 4 years ago, and that was a scene in the kitchen where all the family was sitting behind the kitchen table, and actually it was pretty adequate. They were all sitting, they were playing with their own gadgets. Okay, the gadgets looked something completely different than we use today, but more or less the concept was there. But what they didn't expect was, at one point there was a call coming in. Somebody was phoning. And then all the family was, hey, come off the line, I want to talk to my friend. They couldn't predict that everyone had their own separate lines. So these are those small things that you might predict, but you cannot actually see. So I work for the government. My kind of job is to work with technologies like these and to make these understandable, but also to build a structure. And more or less the whole goal, I think, for governments is to, as we cannot actually predict the future, then the only thing we can actually do is to build adaptive architecture in government, so that the governmental structure or processes or the services government is offering can actually change faster. So I think the current problem for many bureaucratic institutions, but the bureaucratic institutions do not necessarily need to be government. They can be a large-scale corporation or any large-scale organization, because the fundamental governance of these types of organizations were conceived in an era where information was moving in a completely different way. So basically the hierarchical management was conceived when railroads were invented. Bureaucracy is basically the modus operandi, or the way of doing business for any given large-scale organization, because at the time of conception, when the idea and the organizations were conceived, this was the only way of managing a complex organization. But now, I'm pretty sure all of you know that information moves in a very different way, and organizations can be managed also in a different way. One example from Estonia actually is from the civil society domain, which I really, really like. In 2008, 50,000 Estonians came together in one day and cleaned up the whole country. Basically, lots of volunteers went to the forest, brought the trash out. That's lots of labor. And this was all managed by actually a very complex logistics platform in the background. This is something that the volunteers never saw, but because you had loads of trash that you needed to take out, you needed to manage that. A couple of years later, Slovenia did the same thing. 250,000 people came out in one day. They cleaned, that's 15% of the whole population of Slovenia. And last year, there were 18 million people all around the world cleaning up their respectable neighborhoods. And this year, it was, I think, a bit less than 21 million people cleaning up the planet. So this is an example how actually a small group of people can manage a complex organization of lots and lots of different components, people and elements, but it can be done in a way that is, well, from an economical point of view, cheaper. Probably organizing this type, volunteer action of this magnitude 20 years ago, I would argue that would have been impossible. Again, looking from the governmental point of view, our goal is to build adaptive architecture, to build adaptiveness. But the only way we can actually see this is that, like I mentioned you before, the 20 years of building a digital society in the Estonian, more or less, society, but in specific in the bureaucratic domain, has taught us a few lessons, like this is about culture and mindset, not technology. So you could probably implement some new fancy gadgetry relatively fast, but it takes time to people's mindsets and culture to change. So this digital transformation process actually it takes much more time than usually the society or politicians expect. Society nowadays expects to see something like exponential growth curves. You've probably seen some of these hockey sticks, but for me, when I would see a hockey stick anywhere but a silicon-based tech enterprise, then I would probably be worried. If I would go to the doctor and see this some sort of analytical stuff going like that, then probably the doctor will tell me that I will die quite soon. That's not the best side. But also, if I would see this type of a growth curve in the public sector, then I would be seriously worried because probably there is some corruption somewhere. This doesn't happen in the real world. The limits of growth, book done by the Club of Rome already in the 60s or 70s, already stated basically that the exponential growth in physical domain has its limits. So it's about culture building, and that's why I think that the work with youth is fundamental, because probably you have also, in your own respectable domains, have understood that the new generation is something completely different. I have 3 children in my family, 16, 11, and 4. So when I actually work, I talk to people who are older than me. Because when I talk to people who are younger than me, I don't need to explain about, like, self-driving cars. People who are younger than me, they do not ask who is responsible. They ask, when will I get it? So things like that. And they are already kind of digital natives. They are used to these types of changes. And also probably what you know the best is they come up with solutions that are not necessarily the usual ones. I think this is one of the most difficult changes that we have to embark on. Last 20 years in the Estonian bureaucratic administration more or less has been the mindset change from paper to digital. Like, this is fairly easily understandable, but this is extremely difficult to do, actually, because I don't know, people are still used to they still don't like changes, and making those changes is relatively difficult, especially again in the bureaucratic domain where people are used to coffee drinking and stuff like that. But the next 15, 20 years, I kind of feel, or my guess is that it's about changing the mindset from linear to non-linear. So the answers coming, or the solutions, all of our educational systems, the way we've been grown, the way we start solving problems, has more or less been this type of a kind of this lean management, or if then this, that. happens. If this happens, then that happens. Yes, it works in certain domains, but while we see artificial intelligence and all sorts of new technologies coming up, then it's not necessarily so. The answer, I think the best answers do not necessarily come from doing the if, then, this, that type of logic on a constant basis, but maybe the answer comes from around the corner where you didn't look from. And this is highly important because changing the mindset from something that we are all being used to, and also adapting to the situation that the only thing that constantly changes, only thing that doesn't change is that it changes constantly, basically. And the speed of this is going faster and faster. So we need to build ourselves into we need to change our identities to being more open, more flexible, because we know that different business models and different things are changing. We cannot ask our children who do you want to be when you grow up? I think it's more reasonable to ask them, how do you want to spend your time? Because the idea of, I don't know, studying to become a lawyer or a doctor or this learning a new job and then sticking to that for the whole of life will not comply with the generation that we are more or less working with. They will choose differently. There will be different economical models, how they can actually sustain themselves, and probably they will do lots and lots of different things that have not been invented yet today. So, but how do we build a structure for that? And I know education is a very fundamental key, but in terms of governmental structure, we are doing quite a lot to actually build so that this kind of organization would be ready to adapt. Because for example, my personal opinion is that those governments that do not embrace this digital transformation, they actually will become obsolete in the next 15 to 20 years. Yeah, this is my personal, not the Estonian government's opinion, but Emmanuel Macron can put like billions of euros on the French AI policy, but he cannot deliver because fundamentally France is a paper-based bureaucracy. They can do few of those gadgetries, they can help few of those things, but changing the mindset from paper to digital takes longer than the 5-year implementation cycle of that particular strategy, just as an example. In Estonia, and actually this is a cooperation together with Finland, is that we are changing our background architecture to be more adaptive. Currently we use a technology called an X-road, which is a linear type of technology. Basically information is exchanged in a secure encrypted way over the open internet from point A to point B. So if one of those services wants to know something, they ask the other one. And each of those databases actually has a very small proportion of my profile information. What we are changing this into is a technology called X-room, which basically means that information can move from point A, an information system, to a communication room, which is secure. And in that communication room, there not necessarily needs to be B, but there can be C, there can be X, and there can be Z. And those services can change accordingly and much faster and faster. This is a very simple idea, and actually from a technological point of view, it's nothing new. Spotify and Netflix are already using that for a long time, but Spotify and Netflix still are very, well, okay, they are big. Netflix, for example, in terms of the data consumption, but still they're one particular service. The complexity is not that big. Like you go there to watch films, that's it, or some series or something like that. But if we talk about changing the whole governmental structure, which currently in Estonia consists of 651 different nodes, this means public, private, municipal, central governmental organizations and databases, then we are talking about something completely different. Together with changing the way our interoperability, the language the database talks to, the communication room basically, we're also changing the way we procure stuff. Again, in the public sector, we usually, well, in order to avoid potential corruption, there is stupid rules around procurement, and usually the most biggest issues in the public sector are there. But in order to procure ICT, I'm hoping that in 2 years' time, both Estonian and Finnish governmental will, let's say 99% of procurements will be smaller than 20,000 euros. You have probably all heard of stuff that your governments or your countries, there's a large-scale information system being built, millions of euros have been spent, and when it comes out, it doesn't work. So this is something that will continue, and we cannot build information systems on that. If we build the systems based on small modules, then this whole network basically can adapt faster. So, but why is this type of thing important? Is the way we move information, it actually affects the way our organizations move as well. And in order to actually build a working, functioning, well-adapting society, there needs to be things that we call, in a bureaucratic domain, we call distributed trust mechanisms, the ways that we can actually trust a complete stranger. Very simple example of distributed trust mechanism at scale is basically Airbnb. I think probably many of you have tried complete strangers exchanging something of high value. But what Airbnb or platform capitalistic examples have basically shown is that trust is a cultural thing, but it can be scaled. And tech can help to scale it up. But what does distributed trust mean in a human context? Distributed trust in a human context means individual responsibilities and hopefully empathy. Because in order to build this ecosystem of vast complexity, we need to actually redefine the basic rules of engagements within the society on an everyday basis. A very simple example from Estonia is the digital signature, which actually redefined the way we do legal transactions. Like most Estonians probably trust paper-based signatures far less than digital signatures. For example, I used to have a company, and the only time I used paper-based signatures is sometimes when I want to fake some document. And most Estonians do that. If you don't, then you do it in a digital way because it's much faster and easier and less hassle. But we need to redefine these basic rules of engagement, and the metaphor for that would be, there's a kind of a domain in science which is called swarm intelligence, or the best way to explain to you is a flock of birds or a swarm of fish, a school of fish, basically 1,000 fish, 1,000 birds flying, and basically when the eagle is coming, or even if there is like 3 birds, then this is nothing that spectacular. But more or less the rules of engagement are fairly simple. Like one bird actually sees the eagle, tells the next person tells the next person, the next person tells the next person, and so on. You can probably imagine. So this is actually the most effective way of moving information, both in an ICT engineering point of view, but also in an ecological way. So if we could potentially build governmental architecture like this flock of birds, or a school of fish, when a shark is hitting this bunch of fish and they are like, woo, making dynamical movement, then I think this is something that governments of the future should look like. Because we actually do not know what's coming in the future, but the only thing we can actually do is to build architecture that actually perhaps could change when the changes are coming. In order to do that, I mentioned you the changes in the information system architectures, the small modules, the adaptive communication rooms. We also need to kind of change our educational systems. I think it was last week when Estonia was pretty lucky in hitting good results in the PISA test. Though being really happy about it, I am still skeptical that our educational systems are adaptive enough to actually be resilient about the future. I think it was more or less 2 years ago in the World Economic Forum in Davos, when Jack Ma was the person who said something like that we're currently teaching our kids to compete with robots, and this is a fight we cannot win. And I really am sure about that. So, but there are some skills and some things like empathy and like teamwork and like understanding and having interest and things like that. And these are actually very fundamental things in the overarching governance structure. We need to teach our kids to be interested in stuff, to be able to listen to other people, to have actually an interest to try to understand differences. And through that, perhaps we can build an empathic society, and we can actually build not only an empathic society, but society that can transform and adapt to all of those future changes that we can guess and see that's coming, but we actually cannot predict how the life model or the way we will be living in the future will turn out. So hopefully there was some ideas for you, not even scratching the surface in what we actually are doing in the Estonian government, but I think the work with young people is fundamental in actually making that happen. And my half an hour is over. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marten, for this thought-provocative sharing with us as an intro for our today, and strongly advocating for something which we consider essential in youth work. The competencies, the knowledge, skills and attitudes and mindset which we believe would be essential, and we as a youth workers can definitely contribute to. We have a good chance, Marten is still not running away, I hope, for some questions, so please hit the road. Give a sign, I will run with the microphone. Please shortly introduce yourself and then go ahead.
Hello, my name is Valters, I'm from Latvia, and I think I have this question since yesterday's panel, kind of halfly formulated, and maybe because you are very close to government, you have an opinion. When we talk about smart youth work and digital youth work as part of it, we talk about also like policy making and so on. But knowing how policy making works, which is a slow process, do you think it can catch up with what's actually happening with, like, in development of, I don't know, digital tools and artificial intelligence and so on and so on? So maybe we make a, I don't know, a strategy which is already 2 years old and it doesn't work anymore because there's something more. Like in Latvia, something very trivial. Yeah, we have these electro scooters, which is, well, nobody knows what it is, how to classify it as a transport or not. So it's there in the world, but nobody knows what to do with it.
So no, governments will be always lagging behind. Governments and policy making will always be late. That's the problem of the design. In many cases. But what we have more or less found out in Estonia and lots of Estonian top leaders are actually promoting it as well, is if government starts making policies and regulations, it's highly important to make it in a way that actually has, it's difficult to do, but good regulation actually can foster loads of innovation. But then you need to kind of filter out and find those places where this good regulation is needed. I'm pretty sure, and I'm actually more or less happy or understand that governments always will be running behind cutting-edge technology, because governments by design are conservative. Their idea is to regulate everything or in specific domains, and they cannot governments that currently are running towards, there is some interesting blockchain applications, which some of them are, but like 99% are total bullshit. Then or different crypto ideas or different stuff, then I think it should be this way. But what can be done with this more adaptive architecture, what we're doing here in Estonia, both in information technological side, but also the cultural side of actually policy making, it's about actually experimenting and trying out. So policy should not be made from the government point of view. Like current problem is that policy is made by people who do not have a connection with real life. So governments should actually, like Finland is a good example of experimenting and then rolling out the policy. There is other examples in the world as well. So I think governments should more work like that, through experimenting and then implementing some kind of a law or regulation. But this is something that is intrinsically difficult for governmental structure to do, because governmental structures are not used to working like that. And that's why I think we need to have this more adaptive, first technological governments, but in longer run it means that the administrative way of doing business also will change. So I think that's one of the most difficult things, and that's the biggest cultural change, that there is loads of new stuff, but how do we actually understand it? Like this year we had this, probably in Latvia, I haven't been to Latvia for a while, but this electric scooters, like example, like this is a very simple stuff, like I really love them, but some people immediately started that, oh, we need to regulate this and something like that. I think nothing really bad has happened. Like, why? Let it be. Let's see how it works out, and then we can make smarter regulations. So, I don't know. It's a difficult question.
Thank you so much. You were actually well referring to something we heard yesterday when we were visiting Vivistop Creativity Accelerator Lab here in Telliskivi as well. And they said a bit of the same thing, that maybe we don't need to be too worried about as well. Let the kids burn their finger for the first time, and that's part of the learning as well. So maybe that goes for a societal processes on a wider scale as well.
Thank you very much. Also, one question from Latvia. My name is Ilona Bičevska and I'm having NGO. Can you describe the best model for for NGO to be strong, big, but still, flexible?
Yes, in my previous life I've had 2 NGOs that at one point even got some prizes to being the best NGOs in Estonia. So I think in Estonia and Latvia the situation is similar, because it's always, there is few people, and it's always connected to the particular personas basically. So, and if one of those critical people goes, then there's a big hole. One of the things we did in 2006, we started a local community action called New World. It was society, basically. It's the local neighborhood of people. This NGO has died already for a long time ago, so it did fail at that point. But what happened was that I think for NGOs the best and most important thing is the idea and the drive, and the ability to vocalize this idea in different locations and ideas. And this not necessarily needs to be like the companies are doing this mission, vision statement type of a stuff. It needs to be an idea that actually people can open-endedly interpret. So, for example, for the New World Society, the name helped, and this was the historical name of the neighborhood, and nothing esoteric or ideological about it, but it inspired people. And this, for me, this gives me the drive to actually work for the government now, because I have seen the meaning of the world community change within my lifetime, and I have also participated in that. In small languages, I think in Estonia and in Latvia it would be similar, I'm guessing, but again, I don't know the Latvian context. Language is really important, so the words you use to describe, to do your thing. So in the way that people would have the room to interpret this goal. Because in NGOs specifically, like when you go and try to get somebody involved to participate in what it is, they need to know that the thing that they're doing is like something that they actually they need to be on board with that. But I think for me, it's important that, okay, you have an NGO, you want to do something. Then all the people who see that, they kind of interpret that goal for themselves, that, okay, you want to do this specific thing for youth, I don't know what it is, but if another person sees it, and they can make the agenda their own agenda, so that they are the owners of that agenda, then they kind of help. In the New World Society, we also had a rule that if you come up with an idea, you do it. Because there is loads of ideas, everybody has ideas, but making them into life is something that is really difficult. And depending on the idea, yes, the whole community will come and help you, but it's your agenda to get everybody motivated and involved. And this is about creating individual responsibilities. And I think like NGOs and non-profits, it's like now working in the government, it's very funny to see people who lack the experience of working in a volunteer-based organization, or people who lack the experience of doing any sort of creative work. They, I think, misunderstand the big part of the world. And so I think it's about trying to create the individual responsibilities, but you can do that by defining the goal and the vision in an open-ended way.
Hi, my name is Alicia and I'm from Scotland.
Nice.
One of the questions that I have is about the education. And I think it was really interesting when you mentioned empathy and also among other things. But I find it really difficult to find the balance between young people having the empathy and trust in the digital systems, but at the same time ensuring that they're super critical and, you know, when it comes to their data sharing and all of these other things. So how do we keep the balance between the trust and the critical thinking?
This is highly important. I agree. I just a little while ago I was in London, and in this very high-end AI conference, and there was people who were trying to tackle the same problem, and they had done loads of research, loads of stuff, but more or less what they found out, that the most critical audience in today's world in terms of data exchange and in the person, like that you are well aware of what the data value is and who you share what with, it basically was a group of 15 to 25-year-old girls. Because they have probably experienced some sort of cyberbullying in their life in certain areas. And these girls were basically the most aware persons about that, where do I share what and when and this kind of things. This kind of news actually gave me hope, because in Estonia the balance between trust and critical thinking and knowledge around that, the awareness is super low. Like in Estonia, we have all of our critical information systems, logs files have been blockchain since 2012, which gives us a full transparency throughout an ecosystem. So that's since 2012. All Estonian citizens can go to a governmental website and see who has been looking at their data, when and why. So we have that. But very few people actually do it. So this is one of the biggest issues of raising awareness about, I don't know, cyberbullying is one of those symptoms, but just your presence in the web. So I think this is a work a lot for the government and for the regulators and also for some international organizations, that you need to be able to kind of create, and creating this, I don't know, beacons of trust within this huge domain of the internet. There need to be some places that you need to and should and can trust. And this is the mission critical thing, because today when we got like deep fakes and fake news starting to spread, there is loads of information, there is different applications popping up. In that domain, you need to have certain places that are stable. And still, I would argue that at some of these international organizations are slow as hell sometimes, but like the idea of human rights, some of these very basic things we keep on coming back to, because now in the digital age we need to actually redefine them. We need to see them in a new light. My best answer would be that the persons themselves need to be smarter. They need to actually have some interest. But also, as Willie actually mentioned from yesterday to visit the Vivi stop, that I think people need to burn their fingers a little bit in order to understand. Hopefully the burn is not too big, but we need to have some experience. But otherwise, this system cannot work like a nanny state as well. The idea that, I don't know, the government makes everything secure and you can be a happy child and everything works out fine. No, it doesn't work like that. You need to get burned a little and you need to learn. But what governments, and especially I would say youth workers, and I'm guessing that a lot of you are doing that, is it's about raising awareness in this domain. And this is highly complex, I think. I don't know. A very difficult question.
On my way here, I've spoken to the taxi driver. It's interesting because I was coming here in a taxi and I spoke to the taxi driver and I asked him if who's checking his personal information, because I read that's possible within the Estonian system, and the taxi driver told me that he doesn't know about it. So so that's
the thing of awareness. That I think there is 4% of the Estonian overall population have actually done it. And that's a very small proportion, and mostly these are nerds and tech freaks, and like the bulk of things. But in Estonia, it's a different thing as well, because we're a small community and everybody knows everybody anyway. So it kind of is different. But again, this type of a model is totally scalable and applicable in other areas as well. Like in Scotland, you probably have more people than we do have here. But okay, I think there is a lot of empathy between Estonia and Scotland anyway. But in France, for example, where it's over-centralized, and I think you need to have mechanism like that.
Thank you so much, Marten. As a last thing now, really, or was there a question? No. As a last thing, we are about to head off to the Innovation Lab today and look at the problems related to young people and try to see if there could be any good solutions we could see through the digital and technology means. If you would be with us for the rest of the day, what would be one of the problems you would put to the table related to the lives of young people now?
Difficult one. My friend had an example in Estonia. There was he lives in the countryside, and he gave me an overview of what happens in that countryside. And he more or less could define 3 different groups of people. There were the old people, who were all hanging out and talking to their neighbors, and because this was how it was done during the Soviet days, because this was the only way to survive, you needed to have good relationships with your neighbors. Then there's this middle group. In Estonia, this is the 90s, the people who got rich and started something in the 90s. And these are guys who are driving with their SUVs to this court house that is, the walls are high, and they never communicate with their neighbors. Every once in a while, some other people of similar groups drive their SUVs to their court, and then they have a party. But they do not communicate with the neighbors. But what was good was that he could also distinguish a 3rd group. And again, this is the youth in this category. And these people, although they were walking around sometimes like this, they also didn't have a threshold of communicating. They were also communicating with everybody. And they didn't have these types of barriers of being rich, poor, whatever. But because of these digital connectivity devices, they were communicating. They were communicating with the old guys. They were communicating with everybody. So kind of this gives me hope. But again, I think it's about finding a balance there, because you probably all know it, and not too much screen time and stuff like that. It's about trying to make reality more interesting so that people would actually try to communicate and empathize with physical people as well. Yes, digital tools can help, but making reality perhaps more interesting than the screen? Something like that.
Wonderful. Dear colleagues, that was Marten Kaevats from the Estonian Government Office. Thank you so much.
Thank you.